Jake Thornton knew desperation when he saw it, and the white colt that raced into the canyon every dawn carried the same wild urgency that had been eating him alive for 3 years. Following that animal would lead him to a discovery that threatened to crack open everything he'd sealed shut since the day he found his wife's body in the desert. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The first time Jake Thornton noticed the white colt's strange behavior, he dismissed it as coincidence. Dawn had barely broken over the Arizona high desert, painting the red rock formations in shades of amber and rose, when he spotted the young horse racing across the scrubland with singular purpose. The colt moved like a ghost through the sage and mesquite, his pale coat catching the early light until he seemed to glow against the dusty landscape. Jake had been mending fence line on the eastern boundary of the Double T Ranch, the property his grandfather had carved from wilderness 50 years before, and he paused in his work to watch the animal disappear into a narrow canyon he had never bothered to explore. 3 mornings later, the colt appeared again at precisely the same time, following the identical route with the same urgent determination. This time, Jake stood closer to the canyon's mouth, close enough to see the wild intelligence in the animal's dark eyes, the powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath his unmarked hide. The colt was young, perhaps 2 years old, with the rangy build that promised he would mature into something magnificent. But it was his color that captivated Jake most completely. Pure white, without a single marking to mar his coat, the kind of horse that appeared in old stories and fever dreams, the kind men spent lifetimes searching for, without ever finding. Jake Thornton was not a man given to flights of fancy. At 38, he had spent the better part of 2 decades working the ranch his grandfather built, watching the land slowly claim back what human hands had tried to tame. The past 3 years had been particularly brutal. His wife Sarah had died in a riding accident, thrown from her mare during a routine check of the south pasture. She had hit her head on a rock, and by the time Jake found her, the desert sun had already begun its merciless work. The guilt had settled into his bones like dust, the endless wondering if he could have saved her had he been there, had he not sent her out alone that morning because he was too busy with ranch paperwork that suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of her absence. The ranch had suffered along with him. Fences went unmended, water lines sprang leaks that went unrepaired, and the small herd of cattle his grandfather had been so proud of had dwindled to a handful of stubborn animals that seemed to survive more from force of will than proper care. Jake's neighbors in the scattered ranching community around Red Ridge spoke about him in hushed tones now, the way people talk about someone they have written off as broken beyond repair. Even old Tom Brightwater, his closest neighbor and Sarah's uncle, had stopped trying to pull Jake back into the world of the living. But something about the white colt's relentless morning ritual began to penetrate the fog of grief that had become Jake's constant companion. On the 7th morning, he saddled his own horse well before dawn, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, who had been with him since before Sarah died. Copper was reliable and sure-footed, the kind of horse that could navigate the treacherous desert terrain without drama or complaint. Jake packed water and some jerky, though he had little appetite these days, and positioned himself near the canyon entrance to wait. The colt appeared as the sun breached the eastern horizon, right on schedule. This time, Jake was ready. As the white horse thundered past, Jake urged Copper forward, following at a distance that would not spook the younger animal, but would allow him to track where it was going with such determined urgency. The colt never looked back, never slowed, moving with the confidence of an animal that had made this journey many times before. They traveled deeper into the canyon than Jake had ever ventured, following a path that grew increasingly narrow and winding. The walls rose on either side, ancient red sandstone carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that reminded Jake of cathedral spires. The morning sun had not yet reached this deep into the earth, and the air held a coolness that was a blessed relief from the heat that would arrive with full daylight. Copper picked his way carefully over loose stones and around prickly pear cacti, while Jake kept his eyes fixed on the flash of white ahead. The canyon twisted and turned, presenting obstacles that would have discouraged a less determined follower. Jake found himself wondering how the Colt had discovered this route, what drove him to make this pilgrimage every morning without fail. Animals had their reasons, their own mysteries that humans could rarely fathom. His grandfather used to say that horses knew things people had forgotten, that they carried ancient wisdom in their bones that civilization had drummed out of mankind. After what Jake estimated was nearly 3 miles of careful navigation through the increasingly narrow passage, the canyon walls suddenly opened into a hidden basin he had never known existed. What he saw there made him pull Copper to a complete stop, his breath catching in his throat at the impossible beauty before him. The white Colt stood at the edge of a crystalline pool of water, the most brilliant turquoise Jake had ever witnessed, fed by a waterfall that cascaded from a cleft in the red rocks above. The sound of falling water echoed off the canyon walls, creating a music that seemed to belong to some older, purer world. Steam rose from the pool's surface in delicate wisps, suggesting the water emerged from somewhere deep and warm within the earth. Vegetation surrounded the spring, lush and green in defiance of the desert's harshness, cottonwoods and willows and plants Jake could not name. The Colt lowered his head to drink, and for the first time in 3 years, Jake felt something stir in his chest that might have been wonder. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots finding purchase on the smooth rock that surrounded the spring. Copper whinnied softly, sensing the strangeness of this place, the way it seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and desert harshness. The white Colt paid them no attention, focused entirely on the water before him, drinking with the kind of reverence that suggested this was not merely about quenching thirst but something deeper, more essential. As Jake approached on foot, leaving Copper ground-tied near the canyon entrance, he noticed details that made this discovery even more remarkable. The pool was not natural in its current form. Someone had worked this spring, shaping the rocks around its edges, creating small channels that directed overflow into what appeared to be an ancient irrigation system. The stonework was old, far older than anything Jake had seen in his lifetime, covered in a patina of age and weathered smooth by countless seasons. Whoever had built this had done so with skill and patience, understanding water as the most precious resource in this unforgiving land. The Colt finished drinking and moved away from the pool's edge, settling onto a patch of soft grass beneath a cottonwood tree. His eyes never left Jake, watching with an alertness that suggested the animal was deciding whether this human presence represented threat or something else. Jake raised his hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of peace he had learned from his grandfather, who had possessed an almost supernatural ability with horses. The old man used to say that horses could read intentions the way most people read newspapers, seeing through pretense to the truth beneath. Jake spoke softly, his voice barely above the sound of falling water. "Easy now, boy. I mean you no harm. Just curious about what brings you here every morning like clockwork." The Colt's ears flicked forward, processing the sound if not the meaning of Jake's words. After a long moment, the animal lowered his head slightly, the equine equivalent of cautious acceptance. Jake took it as permission to explore the spring more thoroughly, though he kept his movements slow and deliberate, always aware of the Colt's presence. The waterfall itself emerged from a natural grotto in the rock face, water pouring from an opening that suggested extensive cave systems beyond. The temperature of the water surprised Jake when he finally knelt beside the pool and dipped his hand in. It was warm, almost hot, heated by geothermal forces deep beneath the desert floor. He cupped his hands and brought the water to his lips, tasting minerals and earth, clean and pure despite its passage through unknown darkness before emerging here into the light. The water seemed to carry vitality in its very essence, as if drinking from this spring might wash away more than mere physical thirst. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah, about the way she had loved discovering hidden places on the ranch, secret corners where the desert revealed its gentler face. She would have been enchanted by this spring, would have insisted they bring a picnic here, would have filled notebooks with sketches and observations about the plants and wildlife. The thought brought pain, but also something else, a softness to the grief that had been nothing but sharp edges for so long. Perhaps the white colt had brought him here for a reason beyond simple animal routine. As the sun climbed higher, its rays finally reaching into the hidden basin, Jake noticed something else that caught his attention. On the far side of the pool, partially obscured by willow branches, stood what appeared to be a crude shelter. He made his way around the water's edge, the colt tracking his movement with those intelligent dark eyes, and pushed aside the vegetation to reveal a small stone structure. It was little more than 3 walls and a roof of carefully layered rock, but it had been built with obvious care and had withstood however many years or decades since its construction. Inside the shelter, protected from the elements, Jake found evidence of previous human occupation: a rusted coffee pot, a few tin cups, and, most intriguingly, a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the journal, feeling like an archaeologist uncovering something sacred and forbidden at the same time. The leather was old but well preserved, and when he opened to the first page, he saw handwriting in faded ink, dated 1952. The journal belonged to someone named William Brightwater, and Jake felt his heart skip at the surname. Tom Brightwater, his neighbor and Sarah's uncle, never spoke much about his family history, but Jake recalled vague mentions of an older brother who had died young, though the circumstances had always been unclear. Could this journal belong to Tom's brother? And if so, what had William Brightwater been doing in this hidden canyon, building shelters and keeping records? Jake began to read, his back against the stone wall of the shelter, the white colt maintaining his vigil beneath the cottonwood tree. The journal entries were sporadic at first, dated weeks or sometimes months apart, but they painted a picture of a man seeking something beyond the ordinary confines of ranch life. William wrote about discovering the spring by accident while tracking a wild Mustang, about the sense of peace he found here, about his growing conviction that this water possessed properties beyond the merely physical. One entry in particular caught Jake's attention, dated August 1952. "The water here heals more than the body," William had written in his careful script. "I have come here broken in spirit, carrying grief that threatened to destroy me, and this place has offered something I can only describe as restoration. The horses know it. They have always known it. That is why they come here, generation after generation, seeking what humans have forgotten how to find." Jake looked up from the journal to find the white colt had moved closer, standing now at the edge of the shelter's opening, watching him with those impossibly dark eyes. The sun had climbed to its zenith, and the canyon walls glowed red and gold, the spring pool reflecting the sky in shades of turquoise and azure that seemed too vivid to be real. He understood now why the colt came here every dawn, why the animal made this pilgrimage with such unwavering determination. Jake spent the remainder of that day reading William Brightwater's journal, the pages revealing a story that felt uncomfortably familiar. William had lost his young wife to pneumonia in the winter of 1951, and the grief had nearly destroyed him. The entries from those months were brief and haunted, filled with the kind of despair that Jake recognized in his own dark moments. But then William had discovered the spring, and the journal entries began to change, becoming longer, more reflective, infused with something that resembled hope. William wrote about the horses that came to the spring, wild Mustangs that seemed to know about this place instinctively, making their way through the treacherous canyon as if following an ancient map written in their blood. He described watching them drink from the pool, seeing how the injured ones would linger longer, how the sick ones would return day after day until they were whole again. William had started bringing his own horses here, animals suffering from mysterious ailments that the veterinarians in Red Ridge could not explain, and he claimed the spring water had healed them all. The scientific part of Jake's mind wanted to dismiss these claims as the wishful thinking of a grieving man seeking meaning in random chance. But something deeper, something that had been awakened by his own time at the spring, whispered that William Brightwater had discovered something real, something that defied easy explanation. The minerals in the water, the geothermal heat, the particular combination of elements that came together in this hidden canyon. Perhaps there were properties here that modern science had yet to understand or even acknowledge. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the canyon floor, Jake turned to the final entries in William's journal. The last one was dated October 1952, and the handwriting was shaky, suggesting the writer had been ill or exhausted. He wrote about a decision he had made, a choice that would change everything. "I have told my brother Tom about this place," William had written. "He thinks I am mad, that grief has broken something essential in my mind. But I know what I have experienced here. I know what this spring has given me. Peace, purpose, a reason to continue living when living seemed impossible. Tomorrow I leave for California, to start fresh somewhere. The memories are not so thick I cannot breathe, but I leave this journal here in hopes that someday someone else who needs this place will find it and understand they are not alone in their suffering." Jake sat with those words for a long time, feeling the weight of decades collapse between himself and this man he had never met. William Brightwater had walked away from his grief, had found the strength to build a new life elsewhere, and he had left this record as a gift to future sufferers. Tom had never mentioned his brother leaving for California, had never spoken about the spring or this journal. Perhaps Tom had dismissed William's claims as madness, as the ravings of a mind broken by loss. Or perhaps Tom had simply wanted to forget, to move forward without dwelling on the brother who had abandoned their shared heritage for a fresh start in an unknown place. The white colt had settled into a comfortable position near the pool, dozing in the warm afternoon sun. Jake watched the animal, noting the complete peace in his posture, the absolute rightness of his presence here. This was the colt's sanctuary, just as it had been William Brightwater's, just as it might become Jake's own if he allowed it. The question was whether he possessed the courage to accept what this place was offering, whether he could open himself to the possibility of healing. Jake carefully rewrapped the journal in its oilcloth and placed it back where he had found it, a treasure left for the next person who would need its message. He walked to the pool's edge and knelt there, cupping his hands to drink more deeply this time, allowing the warm mineral water to fill him. He had read somewhere that the human body was mostly water, that every cell depended on proper hydration to function. Perhaps what he needed was not just healing of the spirit, but a literal washing away of the toxins that grief had created within him, a cellular renewal that could only come from this particular source. The water tasted different now that he knew the spring's history, infused with meaning beyond its chemical composition. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah again, but this time the memories did not bring the crushing weight that usually accompanied thoughts of his dead wife. Instead, he remembered the good times, the laughter they had shared, the way she had loved the desert mornings when everything felt new and full of possibility. She would want him to heal, would want him to find peace and purpose again, would be angry if she could see how thoroughly he had let grief consume him. The white colt stirred and raised his head, ears pricking forward as if sensing a change in Jake's emotional state. The animal stood and walked deliberately to where Jake knelt by the pool, stopping close enough that Jake could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a long moment they regarded each other, man and horse, connected by their mutual need for this sacred place. Then the colt lowered his head and Jake reached up slowly to touch the white forehead, feeling the softness of the coat, the solid reality of bone and muscle beneath. Something passed between them in that contact, an understanding that transcended language or rational thought. The Colt was not just showing Jake the spring, he was offering companionship to another creature who understood loss and the long journey back to wholeness. Jake felt tears on his face, the first he had allowed himself to shed since Sarah's funeral, and he did not try to stop them. He wept there beside the turquoise pool while the white Colt stood guard, and when the tears finally ceased, he felt lighter than he had in 3 years. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Jake finally stood and prepared to make the journey back to the ranch. The Colt watched him saddle Copper, and Jake found himself speaking to the animal as if it could understand every word. "I will come back tomorrow," he promised, "and the day after that, and the day after that, if you will have me. I do not know if this water can heal what is broken in me, but I am willing to try." The Colt nickered softly, as if in approval, and Jake swung himself into the saddle. The ride back through the canyon felt different than the journey in. Copper seemed to sense the change in Jake's mood, moving with a lighter step despite the upward climb and treacherous footing. The evening shadows were long across the desert when Jake finally emerged from the canyon mouth, the familiar landscape of his ranch spreading before him in shades of purple and gold. He could see the main house in the distance, the barn that needed repairs, the corrals that held his dwindling herd. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, yet something fundamental had shifted in how he perceived it all. Tom Brightwater was waiting on the front porch when Jake rode up, his weathered face creased with concern. The old man stood as Jake dismounted, his eyes taking in the details that told the story of a long day spent away from the ranch. "You had me worried," Tom said without preamble. "Saw your truck still here, but no sign of you anywhere. I was about to round up some boys and start a search." Jake felt a flash of guilt for causing concern, but also something else, a resistance to explaining where he had been and what he had discovered. The spring felt like a secret that should be protected, a sacred space that might lose its power if spoken about too freely. "I took a ride out to the eastern boundary," he said, which was true enough. "Lost track of time." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of a man who knew he was not getting the full story but was too polite to push. "You have not taken a pleasure ride in 3 years, boy. Something happened today." Jake led Copper toward the barn, Tom following at a respectful distance. As he unsaddled his horse and began the familiar routine of brushing him down, Jake found himself wanting to tell Tom everything, to share the wonder of what he had discovered. But something held him back, a sense that this knowledge needed to settle within him before he could share it with anyone else. The silence between them stretched until Tom finally broke it. "Your color is better," he observed. "You look more alive than you have since Sarah passed. Whatever you were doing today, it agreed with you." The statement was so unexpected, so accurate, that Jake stopped mid-brush stroke and turned to look at the old man. Tom was watching him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, the same eyes that Sarah had inherited, and Jake felt the familiar pang of loss that accompanied any reminder of his dead wife. "I found something," Jake admitted finally. "Something your brother William knew about." Tom's expression changed instantly, a shadow passing across his features that spoke of old pain and older regrets. "William," he repeated, and his voice carried a weight that Jake had never heard before. "You found the spring." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Jake nodded, watching emotions play across Tom's weathered face. Grief, anger, something that might have been relief, all cycling through in rapid succession. Tom walked to the barn entrance and stood there looking out at the desert sunset, his back to Jake as he gathered his thoughts. "William told me about that place before he left," he said finally. "Swore it had healing properties, that the water was touched by something beyond our understanding. I thought grief had driven him mad. I told him as much, told him he needed to accept his loss and move forward like a man instead of chasing fairy tales in hidden canyons. The regret in Tom's voice was palpable, and Jake set aside the curry brush to move closer. "What happened to him?" he asked. "Did he really go to California?" Tom nodded slowly, started a new life in San Diego, married again, had children, built a successful business importing goods from Mexico. He died 5 years ago, happy and content, surrounded by family. Tom turned to face Jake, and there were tears in the old man's eyes. He wrote to me every year, inviting me to visit, telling me about his life. I never went, could not forgive him for leaving, for abandoning our land and our shared history for a fresh start somewhere else. Jake understood then that Tom's gruff exterior and reluctance to speak of his brother had been born from guilt, the knowledge that he had dismissed William's gift and driven him away with his skepticism. "And the spring?" Jake asked. "Did you ever go there yourself?" Tom shook his head. "Never wanted to. Seemed like admitting I was wrong, that maybe William had not been crazy after all. Easier to just let it be forgotten, to pretend that conversation never happened." The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the soft shuffling of horses in their stalls and the evening calls of birds settling in for the night. Jake thought about William Brightwater's journal, about the gift he had left for future sufferers, about the white colt that had led him to that sacred place. "There is a white colt," Jake said quietly. "He goes there every morning at dawn. I followed him today, and that is how I found the spring." Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A white colt? No markings at all?" Jake nodded. "He acts like he owns the place, like he is guarding it for something or someone." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "William wrote about a white mare that used to come to the spring when he was there, said she was wild but gentle, that she would let him touch her, even though she would run from any other human. He believed she was the spirit of the spring somehow, that she embodied whatever magic lived in that water." The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood up at this revelation. "The colt could be her descendant," he said. "Wild horses can live a long time in these canyons, and they pass on their knowledge to their offspring. Maybe this colt learned about the spring from his mother or grandmother, the same way William learned about it from the Mustang he was tracking." Tom nodded slowly, a small smile touching his weathered features. "That would make sense. The land has its own wisdom, its own way of teaching those who are willing to learn. I forgot that for a while. Let my pride and my skepticism close me off to possibilities that did not fit my understanding of how the world works." He looked directly at Jake, his eyes serious. "You will go back there, won't you? You will drink from that spring and let it work, whatever healing it can offer." Jake thought about the peace he had felt beside the turquoise pool, about the tears he had finally allowed himself to shed, about the white colt standing guard while he wept. "Yes," he said, "I will go back every day if that is what it takes. I cannot keep living the way I have been, Tom. I am not honoring Sarah's memory by letting grief destroy me. She would want me to heal, to find a way forward." Tom reached out and gripped Jake's shoulder, the gesture carrying decades of affection and shared history. "Then you have my blessing and my support. Take whatever time you need. I will help with the ranch work, make sure things do not fall apart while you're finding your way back to yourself. And Jake," he paused, his voice thick with emotion, "tell William Spring that Tom Brightwater is sorry. Sorry for not believing, sorry for not understanding, sorry for letting pride stand between brothers." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of Tom's regret and his own determination to not make the same mistakes. "I will," he promised, "and maybe someday you will come with me, see it for yourself." Tom smiled, though his eyes remained sad. "Maybe someday, but for now, this is your journey, your healing. Do not let an old man's baggage weigh you down." Jake began his new routine the following morning, rising before dawn to make the journey to the hidden spring. The white colt was already there when he arrived, standing at the pool's edge as if he had been waiting. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that felt both natural and necessary. Jake would arrive as the first light touched the canyon walls, and he would spend several hours at the spring drinking the mineral water, sitting in silence beside the pool, and gradually allowing the peace of the place to seep into his bones. The colt became less wary with each passing day, eventually allowing Jake to approach close enough to touch him without pulling away. Jake had worked with horses his entire life, but there was something different about this animal, an intelligence and awareness that went beyond normal equine behavior. The colt seemed to understand that Jake needed companionship more than conversation, presence more than activity, and he provided both with a patience that felt almost human in its empathy. On the 10th day of his visits, Jake brought a curry brush and began grooming the colt, who stood perfectly still for the attention. As Jake worked the brush through the white coat, removing dust and tangles, he found himself talking about Sarah. He told the colt about how they had met at a county fair, how she had challenged him to a barrel racing competition and beaten him soundly, how her laughter had been the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The words came easier here beside the spring, released by the gentle rhythm of grooming and the non-judgmental presence of the animal who listened without trying to fix or minimize his pain. He spoke about the accident, about finding Sarah's body in the south pasture, about the 3 years of numbness that had followed. The colt's ears flicked back and forth, tracking Jake's voice, and occasionally the animal would turn his head slightly, as if to offer comfort. Jake realized he had not truly talked about Sarah's death with anyone, not even Tom, who had his own grief to manage. He had locked it all away, thinking that silence would somehow make the pain more bearable. But speaking the words aloud here, releasing them into the sanctuary of the canyon, began to drain the poison that had been festering within him. As the days turned into weeks, Jake noticed changes in himself that went beyond the emotional. He was sleeping better, his appetite had returned, and the constant headache that had plagued him for months had disappeared. The dark circles under his eyes faded, and the gray that had been creeping into his hair seemed to have halted its advance. Tom commented on the transformation every time they spoke, marveling at how Jake seemed to be aging backward, returning to the vital man he had been before tragedy struck. Jake also began to notice details about the spring that he had missed during his first visits. The water level never varied despite the lack of rain, suggesting a deep and reliable source. The temperature remained constant regardless of the desert heat or occasional cool mornings. The vegetation around the pool showed remarkable diversity, species that should not have been able to coexist in the same small area, but somehow thrived together in this protected basin. He explored the cave system that fed the spring, finding passages that twisted deep into the rock, some barely wide enough to crawl through, others opening into chambers that echoed with the sound of running water. He did not venture far into these depths, sensing that some mysteries were meant to remain undiscovered, but he felt the age of the place, the weight of geological time that had carved these spaces from solid stone. The white colt had established a routine of his own, arriving each dawn and staying until mid-morning before disappearing back into the desert. Jake never followed the animal when he left, respecting the colt's need for freedom and wild spaces beyond the canyon. But every morning the colt returned, reliable as sunrise, and every morning Jake felt grateful for the companionship that asked nothing of him except presence and honesty. One morning Jake brought his own journal to the spring, a leather-bound book he had purchased in town with the intention of following William Brightwater's example. He positioned himself in the stone shelter and began to write, documenting his experiences and observations. The act of putting pen to paper forced him to articulate feelings he had barely acknowledged, and he found clarity in the process of translating emotion into language. He wrote about the white colt, about the changing quality of light in the canyon throughout the day, about the specific minerals he could taste in the spring water. He wrote about Sarah, about their life together, and his life without her, about the slow process of learning to carry grief without being crushed by its weight. He wrote about hope, a concept that had seemed foreign and foolish just weeks before, but now felt tangible and real, growing stronger with each passing day. The journal became his confession and his prayer, a record of transformation that he would leave in the shelter alongside William's, a testament for whoever might need this place in the future. He understood now why William had felt compelled to document his time here. The spring demanded witness, required that its healing be acknowledged and recorded, not from vanity, but from a deep need to connect suffering across time, to remind future visitors that they were not alone in their pain or their journey toward wholeness. Jake began bringing supplies to improve the shelter, replacing the rusted coffee pot with a new one, adding a small stock of non-perishable food and a better tarp to protect against the rare desert rains. He repaired cracks in the stone walls and cleared debris from the irrigation channels that ancient hands had carved. This work felt right, a way of honoring both William's legacy and the spring itself, maintaining the sanctuary for those who would come after him. The Colt watched these activities with apparent approval, sometimes standing so close that Jake could feel the warmth of his breath on the back of his neck. The animal had become a constant in Jake's life, more reliable than many humans he had known, and he found himself thinking of the Colt not as a wild creature to be observed, but as a friend who had chosen to share this sacred space with him. As September gave way to October, the desert began its subtle shift toward autumn. The brutal heat eased slightly, and the light took on a golden quality that made the red rocks glow as if lit from within. Jake's visits to the spring continued without interruption, and he realized he no longer needed the healing quite as desperately as he had at the beginning. The sharp edges of grief had been worn smooth by time and water, and the patient presence of the white colt who had led him to this place. The morning everything changed began like any other. Jake rose before dawn, made the familiar journey through the canyon, and found the white colt waiting at the pool's edge. But something was different about the animal's demeanor. The colt was agitated, pacing along the spring's perimeter, occasionally pawing at the ground with urgent movements that spoke of distress rather than his usual calm presence. Jake dismounted quickly, approaching the colt with concern. "What is it, boy?" he asked, reaching out to calm the animal. The colt allowed the touch but did not settle, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond Jake's sight, deeper in the cave system that fed the spring. Jake followed the animal's gaze, noticing for the first time that the sound of the waterfall had changed. The usual steady rush of water seemed diminished, irregular, as if something was interfering with the flow from its source. He grabbed a lantern from the shelter and approached the cave entrance with growing apprehension. The white colt followed him to the opening but would not enter, standing at the threshold with obvious reluctance. Jake understood the animal's hesitation. The caves were dangerous, full of unstable rock and unknown passages, but if something was threatening the spring, he needed to investigate. The passage was narrow at first, forcing Jake to move sideways in places, the lantern casting wild shadows on the limestone walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air was thick with moisture and minerals. He could hear the sound of running water ahead, but it was wrong somehow, broken by gurgling and splashing that suggested a blockage. As he penetrated deeper into the cave system, the passage opened into a larger chamber where the underground river that fed the spring flowed over and around smooth stones, worn by centuries of current. What Jake saw made his heart sink. A section of the cave ceiling had collapsed, sending tons of rock into the underground stream. The water was backing up behind the debris, creating a pool that threatened to redirect the flow away from the spring entirely. If the blockage was not cleared, the spring would dry up within days, and the sanctuary that had saved Jake's life would cease to exist. He spent the next hour examining the collapse, trying to understand the scope of the problem. Some of the rocks were small enough that he could move them by hand, but the larger boulders would require equipment he did not have access to in this remote location. The work would be dangerous, conducted in cramped conditions with the constant risk of further collapse, but Jake knew he had no choice. The spring had given him back his life. He would do whatever was necessary to preserve it. When he emerged from the cave, covered in mud and breathing hard from exertion, the white Colt was still waiting. Jake explained the situation out loud, needing to articulate the problem even if his only audience was a horse who could not truly understand. "The spring is in danger," he said. "The water source is blocked, and if I cannot clear it, this place will die." The Colt nickered softly, pressing his forehead against Jake's chest in what felt like a gesture of support and encouragement. Jake rode back to the ranch with a sense of urgency he had not felt in years. Tom was in the equipment barn when Jake arrived, and he looked up in surprise at Jake's early return and disheveled appearance. "What happened?" Tom asked, setting aside the harness he had been repairing. "You look like you have been fighting with the devil himself." Jake explained the situation, describing the cave-in and the threat to the spring. Tom listened with growing concern, his weathered face creasing with worry. "That is serious work," he said. "Dangerous work, especially alone in those caves. You will need help." Jake had been hoping Tom would offer, but he was still surprised by the immediate commitment. "You will come with me?" he asked. Tom nodded firmly. "That spring meant something to my brother, and it has brought you back from the edge of darkness. I'll be damned if I let it disappear without a fight. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "maybe it is time I saw this place for myself, made my peace with William's memory." They spent the rest of that day gathering equipment, ropes and pulleys, crowbars and hammers, lanterns and safety gear. Tom called in a favor from a neighbor who owned a portable winch system, explaining that they needed to move some rocks from a cave on Jake's property without going into detail about which cave or why it mattered. By evening, they had assembled everything they would need, loading it all into Tom's truck for the journey that would begin at first light. That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about the spring, about the white Colt who had led him there, about William Brightwater who had found healing in the same waters decades before. The thought of losing that sacred place filled him with a determination he had not felt since before Sarah's death. He understood now that grief had not destroyed him, but had prepared him for this moment, this opportunity to fight for something beyond himself. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say if she could see him now planning to crawl into dangerous caves to save a hidden spring most people did not even know existed. She would have laughed at the absurdity of it, he realized, but she also would have understood. Sarah had always believed that some places in the world were special, that they carried a kind of magic that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the human need for sacred spaces where transformation could occur. The next morning, Jake and Tom set out before dawn, the truck loaded with equipment and supplies for what they knew would be at least several days of hard labor. The white Colt was waiting when they arrived at the spring, and Tom stopped short at his first sight of the animal, his eyes widening with recognition. "That is William's mare," he breathed. "Same white coat, same dark eyes, same way of standing like he owns the place." "It cannot be the same horse," Jake said gently. "That mare would be over 70 years old by now. But it could be her descendant, carrying the same bloodline and the same knowledge of this place." Tom nodded slowly, unable to look away from the Colt. "The resemblance is uncanny. William used to say that Mare was the guardian of the spring, that she would outlive us all because she was more than just a horse. I thought he was being poetic, romantic about something that could not be proven or measured." Jake understood what Tom was feeling, the shock of seeing something that challenged rational explanation while simultaneously confirming a deeper truth. "Maybe he was right," Jake said. Maybe this Colt is guardian now, carrying on the work his ancestor began. Tom finally tore his gaze away from the white Colt and looked at Jake. "Then we had better make sure he has a spring to guard," he said firmly. The work of clearing the cave-in was every bit as dangerous and exhausting as Jake had anticipated. They started by securing the unstable sections of ceiling with timber supports Tom had brought, working in shifts because the passage was too narrow for both men to labor simultaneously. The air inside the cave was thick and difficult to breathe, heavy with moisture and limestone dust that coated their lungs and made every breath an effort. Tom proved to be stronger than his 70 years suggested, attacking the work with a determination born from decades of regret. As they moved rocks and secured supports, he talked about William, stories Jake had never heard before. He told about their childhood on the ranch, about William's gentle nature and his way with animals, about the young wife he had loved and lost to pneumonia. Tom's voice echoed off the cave walls, mixing with the sound of running water and falling stone, creating a kind of confession that had waited decades to be spoken. "I was cruel to him after his wife died," Tom admitted as they wrestled a particularly stubborn boulder from the debris pile. "Told him to stop wallowing, to be a man about his grief. I thought I was helping, thought I was giving him the tough love he needed to move forward. But I was really just afraid of his pain, afraid that if I acknowledged how broken he was, I would have to acknowledge my own capacity for breaking." Jake understood that fear intimately, the way people avoided grief as if it were contagious, as if witnessing another person's suffering might somehow infect them with the same vulnerability. He had seen it in the faces of his neighbors after Sarah died, the way they crossed the street to avoid speaking with him, the awkward platitudes they offered when avoidance was impossible. It had driven him deeper into isolation, confirming his belief that grief was something to be endured alone. They worked through the heat of the day, taking breaks only when exhaustion forced them to rest. During these intervals, they would drink from the spring, the water cool and revitalizing despite the warmth of the desert afternoon. Tom approached the pool with something like reverence during his first drink, kneeling at the edge as Jake had done weeks before, cupping his hands to lift the water to his lips. Jake watched the old man's face as he tasted the mineral-rich water, seeing wonder and recognition play across his weathered features. "This is what William tried to tell me about," Tom said quietly. "This feeling, like drinking starlight and earth at the same time." Jake nodded, remembering his own first taste of the spring water, the way it had seemed to carry more than mere hydration. The white Colt stood nearby, watching their labor with those impossibly dark eyes, occasionally approaching to nuzzle one of them as if offering encouragement. By late afternoon of the second day, they had cleared enough debris to see that the main blockage was a massive boulder that had fallen from the ceiling's center. It was far too large to move by hand, and the portable winch would be useless in the confined space of the cave. Jake stared at the obstacle with growing frustration, his muscles aching from 2 days of constant labor, his hands blistered despite the gloves he wore. "We need to break it apart," Tom said, studying the boulder's surface for weaknesses. "Look here, you can see natural fracture lines in the stone. If we drill along these cracks and use wedges, we might be able to split it into manageable pieces." The suggestion made sense, but Jake worried about the additional time it would require. The water backing up behind the blockage was already finding new channels, eroding the cave walls in ways that could lead to further collapse. They spent the remainder of that day drilling holes along the fracture lines, working by lantern light as the sun set beyond the canyon walls. The sound of the drill echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space, and Jake's arms felt like lead by the time they finally stopped for the night. They made camp near the spring, too exhausted to make the journey back to the ranch, and sat by a small fire eating sandwiches Tom had packed. The white Colt settled nearby, close enough to be part of their circle, but maintaining the dignity of a wild creature who chose his own company. Tom watched the animal with fascination, occasionally shaking his head as if still unable to believe what he was seeing. "Does he ever leave?" Tom asked. "Or is he always here at the spring?" "He leaves every mid-morning," Jake replied. "Disappears back into the desert until the next dawn. I have never followed to see where he goes." Tom nodded thoughtfully. William wrote that the mayor had a herd somewhere in the canyons to the north, wild mustangs that had never been broken to saddle. Maybe this Colt has family out there too, a wildlife beyond this place. The thought pleased Jake. The idea that the Colt had not sacrificed his freedom to serve as the spring's guardian, but rather chose to return each day from a full and wild existence. It made the animal's presence even more meaningful, a gift freely given rather than a duty performed from lack of options. That night, lying in his bedroll beneath a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Jake thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a broken man, going through the motions of living without any real engagement with life. The white Colt had led him to the spring, and the spring had led him back to himself. Now he was fighting to preserve that sanctuary, working alongside a man who had his own healing to accomplish, his own regrets to reconcile. The third day began with renewed purpose. They inserted steel wedges into the holes they had drilled, then took turns hammering them deeper into the stone. The boulder resisted at first, seeming as immovable as the mountains themselves, but gradually they began to hear the creaking sounds that suggested the rock was yielding to their efforts. Around mid-morning, with a crack that echoed like thunder in the confined space, the boulder split along its natural fault line. The two halves were still heavy, but now they could maneuver them with the ropes and pulleys, dragging them away from the water flow one painful inch at a time. Sweat poured from both men despite the cave's coolness, and their hands were raw inside their gloves. But they did not stop, could not stop, driven by the knowledge that they were winning this battle against stone and gravity. By late afternoon, they had cleared enough of the blockage that water began flowing freely again, finding its ancient path toward the spring pool. They stood in the rushing current, clothes soaked and bodies exhausted, watching as the water level dropped and the normal flow pattern reasserted itself. The sound of the waterfall outside grew stronger, returning to the steady rush that Jake had come to associate with peace and healing. Tom was laughing, actually laughing, the sound echoing off the cave walls. "We did it," he shouted over the noise of the water. "By God, Jake, we actually did it." They made their way out of the cave into the late afternoon sunlight, where the white Colt was waiting. The animal approached them both, nuzzling their wet shirts, and Jake could have sworn he saw approval in those dark eyes. They spent that evening cleaning up their equipment and restoring the area around the spring to its natural state. Tom moved with a lightness Jake had never seen in him before, whistling old ranch songs as he worked, occasionally pausing to drink from the pool or simply stand in contemplation of the turquoise water. The change in the old man was remarkable, as if saving the spring had lifted a burden he had been carrying for decades. As sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold, Tom finally spoke the words that had clearly been building within him since they arrived. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling onto a smooth boulder near the pool. "Something I have never told anyone, not even my wife before she passed." Jake sat beside him, waiting, sensing that whatever Tom was about to share had been locked away for far too long. "When William left for California," Tom began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I told myself I was angry because he was abandoning the family ranch, leaving me to manage everything alone. But that was not the real reason. The truth was, I envied him his courage. He had the strength to walk away from his grief, to start fresh somewhere new, while I stayed here drowning in my own losses and pretending I was fine." Tom paused, his weathered hands gripping his knees as if to anchor himself. "I lost a child," he continued, "a daughter, born too early and too small to survive. My wife nearly died in childbirth, and when it was over, We were left with empty arms and a grief so deep I thought it would swallow us whole. This was before William's wife died, before he found this spring. I never told him about our loss because I was ashamed of my pain, ashamed that I could not be strong enough to carry it without breaking. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, understanding now why Tom had been so harsh with William's grief. The old man had been fighting his own demons, using anger and judgment as shields against feelings too painful to confront. "I am sorry, Tom," Jake said quietly. "I never knew." "No one did," Tom replied. "We buried that baby girl in the family plot and never spoke of her again. My wife wanted to name her Grace, wanted to have a proper headstone, but I refused. I thought acknowledging the loss would make it real, would give it power over us. So we pretended it never happened, and the silence between us grew until we were like strangers sharing a house." Tom's voice broke, and tears tracked through the dust on his weathered cheeks. "When William tried to tell me about this spring, about the healing he found here, I could not accept it because accepting it would mean admitting I needed healing too. It would mean acknowledging that I had failed Grace, failed my wife, failed William, failed everyone who counted on me to be strong." Tom looked at Jake with eyes that held decades of accumulated pain. "I have been running from that truth for 50 years, and it has poisoned everything it touched." The white Colt approached as if sensing Tom's distress, resting his head gently on the old man's shoulder. Tom reached up to stroke the animal's neck, his movements tender despite his rough hands. "But you know what I realized today, down in that cave, moving those rocks with you," Tom continued. "Strength is not about refusing to break. It is about having the courage to put yourself back together when you do." William understood that. He let this spring help him heal, and then he went out and built a new life. That took more strength than I ever had. Jake put his hand on Tom's shoulder, offering silent support. "You are here now," he said. "That takes strength too. Facing what you have been running from, telling the truth after all these years, that is courage." Tom nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I want to do something," he said. "I want to put a marker here at the spring, something with Grace's name on it. Not a gravestone, but a remembrance. A way of saying she mattered, that her brief life had meaning even if I was too afraid to acknowledge it before." The idea felt right to Jake, appropriate for this place that had become a sanctuary for broken souls seeking wholeness. "We can do that," he said. "We can create something beautiful to honor her memory." Tom smiled through his tears, and Jake saw in that moment the beginning of true healing, the kind that came not from forgetting, but from finally allowing himself to remember with love instead of shame. They stayed at the spring that night, neither man wanting to leave the peace they had found there. The white Colt remained close, a silent witness to their conversation and their tears, offering the same patient presence he had given Jake during his own darkest moments. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Tom shared stories about his daughter, about the hope he and his wife had felt during the pregnancy, about the devastation of loss, and the long years of silence that followed. Jake listened, understanding that Tom needed to speak these words aloud, needed to give voice to grief that had been trapped inside him for half a century. The spring seemed to absorb their pain, the gentle sound of falling water, creating a backdrop of constancy against which human suffering seemed both profound and temporary. In the morning, they would return to the ranch and resume their normal lives, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just neighbors connected by tragedy and ranch boundaries. They were brothers in grief, bound together by their shared journey toward healing. The white Colt settled near their fire, his white coat gleaming in the firelight like snow in summer. Tom watched the animal with wonder, finally understanding what William had tried to tell him all those years ago. This place was sacred not because of any supernatural properties, but because it offered what humans most needed, and rarely found. Permission to be broken, space to grieve, and time to heal without judgment or expectation. As Jake drifted toward sleep, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the white Colt who had persisted in his daily pilgrimage until Jake finally followed. He thought about William Brightwater finding this place in his own time of need, about Tom finally confronting the grief he had buried for 50 years, about the way pain could connect people across decades if they were brave enough to acknowledge it. The spring had saved them all in different ways, offering not a cure but a sanctuary where healing could begin. The memorial for Grace took shape over the following weeks, a collaborative effort that brought Jake and Tom even closer together. They chose a spot near the stone shelter where William's journal still rested, a place that caught the morning light and overlooked the spring pool. Tom worked with local stone, selecting pieces of red sandstone that seemed to glow when wet with the mineral water, fitting them together with the patient skill of a man who had built ranch fences for half a century. Jake helped with the construction, but this was truly Tom's project, his way of finally honoring the daughter he had been too afraid to properly grieve. The memorial was simple but beautiful, a curved wall of carefully placed stones with a small alcove at its center. In the alcove, Tom placed a copper plaque that he had commissioned from a metalworker in Red Ridge. The inscription was brief but profound. Grace Elizabeth Brightwater, daughter, beloved, remembered. Born and returned to heaven on the same day, but forever living in the hearts of those who loved her. The day they finished the memorial, Tom stood before it with tears streaming down his weathered face, his hand resting on the smooth copper surface. "I should have done this 50 years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Should have let myself feel this, let my wife share her grief instead of forcing us both into silence." Jake stood beside him, one hand on the old man's shoulder, offering the comfort of presence without empty platitudes. The white Colt approached the memorial, sniffing the stones carefully before settling nearby as if to stand guard. Tom laughed through his tears, reaching out to stroke the animal's neck. "You approve, boy?" he asked. "You think Grace would like having her name here in this beautiful place?" The Colt nickered softly, and Tom nodded as if receiving confirmation from an oracle. Word of the spring and its healing properties began to spread quietly through the ranching community, though Jake and Tom were careful about who they told. They did not want the place overrun by curiosity seekers or exploited for commercial gain. Instead, they shared the location only with those who seemed to truly need it, people carrying grief or pain that required the kind of sanctuary the spring provided. A young widow whose husband had died in a tractor accident came first, led to the canyon by Tom, who recognized in her face the same devastation he had carried for so long. She spent a week visiting the spring daily, sitting beside the pool in silent contemplation, drinking the mineral water and slowly allowing her tears to flow. When she finally left, she hugged both Jake and Tom, thanking them for giving her a place where she could fall apart without fear of judgment. Others followed over the months that ensued. A rancher whose son had been killed in Afghanistan, a mother who had lost her child to cancer, a man struggling with injuries from a riding accident that had left him unable to work. Each person found something different at the spring, but all of them found peace, the space to grieve or heal, or simply rest in a world that usually demanded constant forward motion without time for processing pain. The white Colt became a fixture in these stories, appearing reliably each dawn regardless of who was visiting the spring. Some people reported that the animal would approach them during their darkest moments, offering the kind of wordless comfort that only animals can provide. Others claimed the Colt had led them to discover things about themselves or the spring that they would have otherwise missed. Jake listened to these accounts with understanding, knowing from his own experience that the Colt operated according to wisdom that transcended normal animal behavior. Jake's ranch began to thrive again as his own healing progressed. He repaired the fences that had fallen into disrepair, rebuilt his cattle herd with stock purchased from neighboring ranches, and hired a young hand to help with the daily work. The difference was not just in the physical improvements, but in Jake's approach to the work. He no longer went through the motions mechanically, but engaged with genuine interest and care, finding satisfaction in the rhythm of ranch life that had once felt like a prison. He still visited the spring most mornings, though no longer from desperate need, but from a desire to maintain the connection he had found there. The white colt greeted him like an old friend, allowing Jake to groom him, and sometimes even accepting a halter for short rides around the canyon basin. But the colt never lost his wildness, never became fully domesticated, maintaining the dignity and freedom that made him such a powerful presence. Tom experienced his own transformation, reconnecting with memories of his wife and daughter that he had locked away for decades. He began visiting his wife's grave regularly, speaking to her about Grace and about the memorial he had built at the spring. He told Jake that he felt lighter somehow, as if carrying the secret of his daughter's existence had required energy he had not realized he was expending. Now that the truth was acknowledged and honored, he could breathe more freely. One morning in early spring, nearly 6 months after Jake had first followed the white colt to the spring, Tom arrived at the canyon with news. "I heard from William," he said, his face split by an enormous smile. "His grandson found my address and sent a letter. William is 87 now, living in a retirement home in San Diego, and he wants to know if I would come visit." Jake felt a surge of joy for the old man, seeing the hope and excitement in his eyes. "Will you go?" he asked. Tom nodded vigorously. "Already booked the flight." "And Jake," William asked about the spring in his letter. Wanted to know if it was still there, if anyone was taking care of it. He seemed to know somehow that I had finally made my peace with what he found all those years ago. They stood together beside Grace's memorial, the white colt grazing peacefully nearby, and Jake felt the weight of completion settling over the moment. The spring had brought them both back from the edge of despair, had reconnected brothers separated by pride and time, had created a sanctuary that would continue to offer healing to those who needed it most. The white colt raised his head suddenly, ears pricked forward as if hearing something beyond human perception. Jake followed the animal's gaze toward the canyon entrance and saw something that made his breath catch. A small herd of wild mustangs was making its way down the trail, led by a gray mare with wise eyes. The white colt nickered a greeting, and the mare responded, bringing her family to drink from the spring that had sustained their kind for generations beyond counting. Tom stood transfixed, watching as the wild horses approached the pool with the same reverence the white colt had always shown. "There must be a dozen of them," he whispered. "Young ones, old ones, all coming here like pilgrims to a shrine." Jake counted 14 horses in total, ranging from a gangly foal who could not have been more than a few months old to an ancient stallion whose muzzle was gray with age. They moved around the spring with practiced familiarity, each finding their place to drink, the hierarchy of the herd clear in their positioning but without aggression or conflict. The white colt moved among them with obvious affection, touching noses with the gray mare who appeared to be his mother, playfully nipping at younger horses who might have been siblings. Jake realized he was witnessing something rare and precious, a glimpse into the secret life of wild mustangs who had made this hidden canyon part of their territory. The herd knew about the spring, just as the white colt did, passed down through generations the knowledge of where healing water could be found. As the horses drank and rested, Tom pulled out his phone and took photographs documenting this moment that seemed to exist outside of normal time. "William will want to see this," he said quietly. Proof that everything he believed about this place was true, that the magic he found here was real and lasting. Jake nodded, understanding that these images would serve as a kind of reconciliation, visual evidence that William's faith in the spring had been justified all along. The herd stayed for nearly an hour, the older horses resting in the shade while the younger ones explored the basin with playful curiosity. The foal discovered Grace's memorial and spent several minutes investigating the stones with his soft muzzle, as if understanding somehow that this place commemorated loss and love. Tom watched with tears in his eyes, seeing in the young horse's innocent exploration a kind of blessing on the memorial he had built. When the herd finally departed, following the gray mare back toward the canyon entrance, the white colt remained behind. He stood at the pool's edge, watching his family disappear into the desert, then turned to look at Jake and Tom, as if to confirm that his duties as guardian required him to stay. Jake walked to the animal and rested his hand on the strong white neck, feeling the pulse of life beneath the coat, the steady heartbeat that had become as familiar to him as his own. "Thank you," Jake said softly, "for leading me here, for showing me there was a path forward when I thought I was lost forever." The colt turned his head to look at Jake with those impossibly dark eyes, and Jake saw in them acceptance and understanding, a wisdom that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the deep knowing that connected all living things in their shared experience of joy and suffering. Tom left for California 2 days later, his truck packed with photographs and stories to share with the brother he had not seen in over 60 years. Jake drove him to the airport in Phoenix, and they embraced at the departure gate with the unself-conscious affection of men who had saved each other's lives in the most fundamental way. "Tell William the spring is in good hands," Jake said. "Tell him his journal helped me find my way back." Tom nodded, his eyes bright with anticipation and nervousness. "I will tell him everything. About Grace's memorial, about you and Sarah, about the white colt and his herd. I will tell him I was wrong to doubt him, wrong to let pride keep us apart for so long." Jake watched the old man walk toward security, seeing in his step a lightness that had not been there 6 months before, the physical manifestation of a burden finally set down. Jake returned to the ranch and settled into a new rhythm of life, one that balanced the practical demands of ranching with regular visits to the spring. He continued to bring people there who needed what the place offered, always with the white colt's tacit approval, always with respect for the sacred nature of the canyon. He filled journals of his own, adding to the record that William had started, creating a chronicle of healing that would guide future visitors. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, Jake made the journey to the spring carrying wildflowers he had gathered from the hills she had loved. The white colt was waiting, as he always was, and together they stood beside the pool in comfortable silence. Jake spoke to Sarah then, told her about his journey through grief and back to life, about the spring in the white colt, and the unexpected grace of finding purpose in preserving a sanctuary for broken souls. He told her about the people he had helped, about Tom's reconciliation with William, about Grace's memorial and the wild Mustang herd that still visited the spring. He told her he would always love her, that her death had broken something in him that could never be fully repaired, but that he had learned to live with the brokenness, to let it make him more compassionate rather than more bitter. The white colt stood close throughout this one-sided conversation, offering the patient presence that had become his gift to those who visited this place. As Jake prepared to leave that afternoon, he turned for one last look at the spring, at the turquoise pool that had saved his life and the lives of so many others. The white colt stood at the water's edge, perfectly still, his coat gleaming in the late sun like fresh snow on distant mountains. In that moment, Jake understood with complete clarity that some things in this world transcended explanation or logic, that mystery and meaning could coexist, that healing came not from forgetting pain, but from finding the courage to carry it forward with grace. The canyon walls glowed red and gold as the sun touched the western horizon, and somewhere in the distance, a wild Mustang called to its herd. The white colt raised his head and answered, a sound that echoed off the ancient rocks and filled the hidden basin with a music older than human memory. Jake mounted Copper and began the journey home, knowing he would return tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as the spring flowed and the white colt kept his faithful watch. Behind him, the waterfall continued its eternal song, and the sacred spring offered its healing waters to all who came seeking restoration, just as it had for generations past and would for generations yet to come. Jake followed the animal's gaze toward the canyon entrance and saw something that made his breath catch. A small herd of wild mustangs was making its way down the trail, led by a gray mare with wise eyes. The white colt nickered a greeting, and the mare responded, bringing her family to drink from the spring that had sustained their kind for generations beyond counting. Tomorrow they would start planning the memorial for Grace, something simple but meaningful that would stand beside William's shelter as a testament to the lives that had touched this place. But tonight, they simply sat in grateful silence, two men who had found their way back from the edge of darkness, guided by a white colt who understood that some journeys require a gentle but persistent guide.